Hi, everybody. I'm Jeremy, Ron. So I'm really excited to be here with my friend Ron Chernow. Ron and I got to be friends in the course of our involvement with Hamilton, an American musical. And it's really exciting to be here tonight because in the course of that friendship, we never once had a conversation about Ulysses S. Grant. And I haven't seen him since before I read the book. So everything you're going to hear tonight is a completely original, fresh conversation with my friend about this. Before we start, there are two fun pieces of news to share about Ron's book. The first is a piece about the book that just went up on the website of The Atlantic. Ta-Nehisi Coates, who has become a genuine authority on this era, has just deemed Ron's book, he has written of it that it hits like a Mack truck of knowledge and that stupid doesn't stand a chance, which is going to look great on the paperback. That's the second best piece of news about Ron's book that has broken today. I'll let Ron tell you the first best piece of news.
Yeah, the other nice piece of news, and it just appeared on the internet, is that Lionsgate and Appian Way have bought the movie rights to Grant. And
just wait, no.
And Appian Way is probably, a lot of you know, is the production company of Leonardo DiCaprio, who will be the producer.
That's
and one of the executive producers will be yours truly.
There we go.
But the most important thing that happened today is that I get to appear in front of this beautiful Chicago audience. Forget everything else.
So one of the things that your book convinced me is that Ulysses S. Grant is about 100 times more interesting a figure than I realized.
Yeah.
I only know that because you wrote the book and I read it. How did you know that and feel it deeply enough that you decided at some point you're willing to spend a couple years of your life with this guy?
Well, you know, in terms of why I decided to write the book, I had always had a fantasy about doing a big sweeping saga of the Civil War and Reconstruction. And Grant is really the figure who unites those two periods because they're really two acts of the same drama. And I always felt that Americans know an enormous amount about the Civil War. It's very impressive. They know every general, they know every battle. But they usually know little or nothing about Reconstruction. And I feel that to know everything about the Civil War and nothing about Reconstruction means, to use a theater metaphor which seems apt, sitting next to Jeremy, to know everything about the Civil War and nothing about Reconstruction means that you've walked out in the middle of the play, and the play has a very different ending from the one that it seems to at Appomattox. You know, so what I look for figures who created basic building blocks in American society, which I think that Grant had done. There's also a kind of perverse contrarian streak in my nature that came out when I decided to do Hamilton, where I felt that he had been, forgotten and misunderstood and demonized. And I felt that Grant's life had been so belittled and distorted by myths. And, if you go to, I don't know how many people, if any, in the audience have been to Grant's tomb, and Grant is buried in Grant's tomb. Despite Groucho's joke, that it's the largest mausoleum in North America. And it reflects the importance that the Americans assigned to Grant at the time, that they thought that after Abraham Lincoln, he was the second most important American, the second half of the 19th century. And I really felt that it was, time to dust him off and bring him back.
Well, one of the things that struck me about the book is how unlikely it was that he ended up in that position. I mean, from reading the book, I got a new appreciation of the fact that as late as, 3 years before the war started, this is not the phrase you use, but he was a total loser, right? He had washed out of the army. He couldn't start a business.
I phrased it a little more elegantly in the book.
But we don't have a lot of time. But this is someone who was, it's poignant, it's horrifying with the things that he had to put up with, and suddenly he comes out of the phone booth and he's Superman.
Yeah, when the Civil War breaks out, he's almost 30, has a wife and 4 children. In desperation, he's been forced to go to his overbearing father and beg for a job in his father's leather goods store. in Galena, Illinois, in the Mississippi, where he takes a job junior to his two younger brothers as a clerk in the store. So this was like the ultimate humiliation for him. And so Grant is pushing 40. It looks like this is going to be a completely obscure, forgettable life that won't, even merit a footnote in the history books. And then the Confederacy fires on Fort Sumter. Grant had gone to West Point, so he still had all of that military lore stored in his mind. He'd served with distinction for several years in the Mexican Army. And so the war breaks out. There's a desperate shortage of trained officers. And so here this clerk who was failed in one business venture after another, who was drummed out of the Army for drinking in disgrace. 2 months after Fort Sumter, he's a colonel. 4 months later, he's a brigadier general. 10 months later, he's a major general. And by the end of the war, he's general-in-chief with 1 million soldiers under his command, this man who had never had a single person employed for him before. So I think that, I don't know that there's a more improbable or kind of dreamlike transformation. And one of the things you're asking, what attracted me to the story, all the other people that I'd written about, I felt that they were like kind of, racehorses built to run. They were thoroughbreds. They were going to succeed in whatever they did because they had a drive and ambition and a focus. When you read about Alexander Hamilton, even as a teenager, that he's going to soar in the wild blue yonder. Whereas in the case of Grant, certainly the highs are as high as the highs in my other book, but the lows are as low, are much, much lower than anything before. And this is someone who keeps hitting bottom, and success is a very, very kind of, slippery slope that he keeps falling back from.
So you've got, there's the whole middle section of the book is the war, and it's following his campaign. Grant starts in the West and then makes his way to the East. And you give a sense of real drama. You really feel the stakes in these battles. And I'm always curious. I mean, there is a rich tradition of fiction and nonfiction books about war, about combat. You've written about it in the Washington book and the Hamilton book.
Yeah.
Just as a technical question, are there books that you go back to that have been written about war, fiction or non, that you take as inspiration, as models, or as cautionary tales, ways not to write about combat?
No, I felt that, I obviously read an enormous number of books on the Civil War. I read an enormous number of Grant biographies, and I felt that in many of them, the kind of rich drama and atmospherics, were missing. When I started working on the book, I should explain, a so-called friend came up to me one day and said, Ron, how do you write a great biography of someone who wrote a great autobiography? And I have to say that I was kind of reeling from that question for several weeks. But then I, realized that for me, my job as a biographer is to talk about what Grant didn't want to talk about. And I mean, there are kind of some small omissions from the great personal memoirs, like there's no mention of his two-term presidency, for starters, but there's no mention of the drinking issue. There are no mentions of the business failures. But of course, the greatness of the book lies in the description of the battles. So how do I, compete with that? And I realized, number one, you're seeing in Grant's memoirs, you're seeing the war through his eyes. So what I want the reader to see Grant in the battle, because, when you read Grant, you're sort of looking out through, the window of his vision. And also, it was sort of fun in a way to compete with Grant on this because, Grant had this very spare, extraordinarily effective style. But I think that there was an opportunity to do something very kind of richly atmospheric. And particularly, I had done, having done Hamilton and Washington, I had been through the Revolutionary War twice, and the Revolutionary War battles were really very small and compact compared to the Civil War. There might be 2,000 or 3,000 people in the battle. Suddenly, like Shiloh, there are 100,000 people there. There are 24,000 casualties in a 48-hour period, and so the horrifying scale of the carnage of the Civil War, there was kind of a fascination for me in writing about it, because it was like sort of nightmarish industrial scale death for the first time. There'd never been anything like it in American history. And what was also wonderful was that the soldiers in the Civil War was a very highly educated group of soldiers. There were a lot of college graduates. There were an enormous number of people who were writing letters and diaries. And so I found when I was doing the Revolutionary War, it was often kind of, frustrating in terms of trying to capture all of these details, that would bring it to life. Whereas with the Civil War, it's bottomless. You can get, as many, you get thousands of, people recollecting, this battle from every conceivable angle. And then at the same time, when you're writing about the 18th century, people don't gossip as much. In the 19th century, everyone is gossiping about everyone else, which is great for a biographer.
Right.
And also when you're writing about 18th century figures, newspapers at the time, they were sort of more like, the New Republic today. They kind of had essays, often anonymous essays with Roman pseudonyms. 18th century newspapers didn't do profiles. They didn't do interviews. They didn't do features. So you have all of these, Civil War camps that are swarming with correspondence. Then also there were many biographies of Grant done during his lifetime. And so I was able to use the research of those biographers who had done oral histories with people who knew Grant from the time that literally he was a baby till the week that he died. And so I found, for me, I just kind of kept marveling at the resources at hand, which I felt really, because Grant and these battles come alive in the extraordinary anecdotal material of all these reminiscences.
So, right. So this is one of the things that I'm struck by in the book is the richness of the writing. I mean, I assume everyone here is going to go out and get the book. I'm just telling you, then give yourself some time. Because the book is 1,000 pages long, right?
I'm aware of that.
But how do you know? But it's a question. I mean, there's a way, there are Grant biographies that are 150, there are the Penguin Lives length. There's a way to do a life of Grant that's really short. There's a way to do it that's the length of your Hamilton book or your Washington book. Yeah. And there's this version. How did you know this was the version that you needed to do?
Well, I felt that so many of the biographies of Grant were really Civil War histories in disguise. And I wanted to change the whole shape of Grant biographies because in most Grant biographies, the 4 years of the Civil War might be about 90%, of the book. And I really felt that this man led 9 lives, and I wanted to, devote attention to all of them. For instance, after he leaves, the presidency, he takes an around-the-world tour for 2 years and 4 months, and he meets every conceivable, prince and potentate and emperor and president, prime minister in the world, meets Queen Victoria, meets, Bismarck. Or even the period between the end of the Civil War and the start of his 2-term presidency, where he still is general-in-chief and briefly acting Secretary of War. And it's an extraordinarily dramatic period. Number one, the South during Reconstruction is placed under military rule. It's carved up into 5 military districts. They're reporting to Grant. Grant is effectively the czar of the South. He also finds himself right in the middle of the whole impeachment controversy with Andrew Johnson. So I've never had a book. I was saying to you backstage, I mean, this was in many ways, even though it was so long and challenging, this was in many ways the most fun for me to write because I felt, oh my God, this is wall-to-wall action. I felt just so blessed. I would wake up thinking, oh my God, I get to do Shiloh today. Oh my God, I get to do Vicksburg or Appomattox, or whatever. It was really rather thrilling. And I found with all of the other books, there were always sections of the book that I felt as a dutiful historian I had to cover. I mean, for instance, with Hamilton, I had to do the Federalist Papers, that would be a very significant omission. Was it fun for me to write about the Federalist Papers and sort of give you an overview, of those 85 essays? No. Are they the most exciting sections to read? No. But I really felt, again, as kind of a dutiful historian, that I had to do that because it was such a significant part of his life. Grant, more than any other book, I never had a day like that where I said, oh, I have to write about that. It was always, ooh, I have to write about this.
This requires a certain thick skin for your imaginative experience of these people, though. I mean, one of the things that struck me is finally Appomattox happens. So Grant and Lee, they meet in the house, and the war is over. And then it gets worse in some ways, because what happens when Johnson is president, this is what you said about the military rule in the South, and something that feels unnervingly timely now is then you immediately see the way the South is going to try to unravel the result of the war.
Absolutely, yeah.
And can you talk about that? Because Grant is in some ways the pivotal figure in trying to resist the undoing of what he had achieved.
Right. I mean, Grant comes to represent two, completely different impulses. You all know the story that at Appomattox, Grant, who had been the scourge of the South, Grant suddenly becomes the savior of the South because he's extraordinarily magnanimous at Appomattox Courthouse. The Confederate soldiers are famished. He immediately issues 25,000 rations. He allows the Confederate soldiers who surrendered to retain their horses and mules, which was very important since a lot of them were farmers. He allows the Confederate officers to retain their sidearms. He does not allow his men to gloat or celebrate. His wife, Julia, wants him to enter Richmond, which has fallen and had been the capital of the Confederacy. And Grant says, Julia, don't you realize how bitter defeat is for these people? Would you want me to enter, and throw it in their face? And in fact, after the war, there was a proposal to put in the rotunda of the U.S. Capitol a painting of Lee surrendering to Grant, and Grant vetoed it. He thought that the South would be embittered and humiliated by that. Okay, so for all these things, he's kind of beloved by the South. But then what happens? There is such a violent backlash against the war and against Reconstruction, because the 4 million former slaves are now full-fledged citizens. And then with the 15th Amendment, and Grant was probably the foremost force behind it, those 4 million blacks, now American citizens, are given the right to vote, at least black males. And the white South is petrified because 36% of the population of the South was black. There were two states, South Carolina and Mississippi, where a majority of the population was black. And so the Ku Klux Klan, which was formed in 1866 as a social club for Confederate veterans, suddenly morphs into this terroristic militia organization that comes to rule every county in the South. And suddenly thousands of blacks are being murdered without a single prosecution.
Right.
And Grant, as president, appoints a crusading attorney general named Amos Ackerman, who brings 3,000 indictments against the Klan, wins more than 1,000 convictions at a time when no Southern sheriff would arrest a member of the Klan, no Southern jury would convict a member of the Klan, no Southern white would testify against the Klan. So suddenly Grant, who at Appomattox, and this is the story everyone knows, was seen as the symbol of North-South reconciliation. Suddenly, as he's forced to send in federal troops and federal marshals to crush the Ku Klux Klan, which he does, suddenly he's being accused of bayonet rule, and he's, Grant the new Caesar. So instead of being the symbol of reconciliation, he's considered, the symbol of Northern oppression. And this is a struggle that Grant will have throughout his life. And frankly, I think had Abraham Lincoln lived, he would have had that same struggle.
Well,
and I like to think he would have reacted the same way.
Right. I mean, you document the way this cycle starts happening immediately. I mean, in 1866, the guns are still warm from the shooting, and it requires federal intervention to protect the rights of black citizens in the South, and then that intervention causes a backlash. And so the backlash leads to more violence, and the violence leads to more need for federal intervention. And it just keeps going and going and going, so that pretty rapidly you have you have such widespread violence that it's poignant to see Grant realizing. He seemed to, I mean, at least what I get, the sense I get from the book is that it wasn't just that he was more determined to stop it, is that he had a more acute sense of where this was gonna lead, if there wasn't some way to get the South to come to its senses.
He saw the South completely undoing the verdict, of the war. And the interesting thing is President Andrew Johnson, who followed Lincoln, He sent Grant on a tour of the South. This was December 1865, so about 6 months, 7 months after Appomattox. And Grant comes back and he does a report saying that the white South is very chastened, that they were going to be very cooperative. But then the backlash begins, and the backlash, alas, is very topical and pertinent to the moment, because a group of Southern historians and a group of Southern generals called the Lost Cause School essentially begin to, the South could have reacted in one of two ways to the Civil War. The South could have said that, because of the madness of its political leaders, and the madness of its generals that had been led into this suicidal war, it was actually something like about a quarter or a fifth of the entire male population of the South. Adult population South was wiped out by the war. This was a catastrophe for the South on so many levels. So the white South could have kind of risen up in righteous indignation against its own leaders for having led them into the folly and the badness and, yes, the treason of the Civil War. Instead, the opposite happens. That these Lost Cause School writers and generals begin to completely rewrite the history of the Civil War. They begin to romanticize it. They start out by saying that slavery was a great blessing to the slaves, and the slaves were all kind of happy and contented. They say that the cause of the Civil War was not slavery, but states' rights. Mm-hmm. A little hard to imagine that 750,000 people died in the cause of states' rights. Mm-hmm. They begin to argue that Lee was the superior general. Not only was he a far superior general to Grant, but he was a perfect Christian gentleman, and he was this honorable aristocratic.
Is this sounding familiar to anybody?
Well, the interesting thing is, what I'm describing, and then also the view was Reconstruction instead of being a noble experiment in trying to create a biracial society, that it was this fiasco of corrupt carpetbag politicians and illiterate black legislators. The amazing thing is, if I were to ask people in the audience what to this day is still the most famous Hollywood movie about the Civil War, you would all say Gone with the Wind. And Gone with the Wind completely reflects what I just said, was this kind of Southern propaganda campaign, which was influential not only in the South, but throughout the nation. And part of that was creating this, image of Grant as this, drunken, bumbling general who somehow, some mysterious reason, managed to defeat Lee, and that he was then a corrupt president. And so I really felt that in doing that, it's a question of undoing 150 years of propaganda, and the South was extraordinarily successful at doing it. And unfortunately, what happened is, and it's the reason we're fighting over the Confederate monuments now, because of the success of that Lost Cause School, we never had in this country kind of truth and reconciliation process of really talking about slavery and what happened.
So you're the person to put on the spot about this, because Ulysses S. Grant isn't here to answer it for us. Mm-hmm. A general who works in the White House just said that the Civil War happened because of a failure to compromise.
Yeah.
What would your general who worked in the White House say about that?
He would have said that the country had been doing nothing but trying to compromise ever since the creation of the country. I mean, the Constitution itself was crafted as an exercise in compromise over the issue of slavery. The slave trade was protected, for 20 years. Slaves were counted, each slave was counted as 3/5 of a person for the purpose of electoral representation. And then we had the Missouri Compromise in 1820, and Missouri's admitted as a slave state, and Maine as a free state. And then we have the Compromise of 1850. I mean, we had been compromising the entire history of the country up until that point. And finally, there was no compromise. In fact, I was talking about Grant's Around the World tour, and he had a fascinating conversation with Bismarck, and he said, we realized when the war started that we had to destroy slavery, that slavery was a stain upon this country, that we could not be a republic and have people being bought and sold like cattle. And he said there was no compromising with these people, and we had to destroy slavery, and we had to destroy the Confederacy. And so I think that Grant would have been horrified
Right.
by what Kelly said.
So when you talk about Grant that way, it's your admiration for him comes through. But I was struck by you spend, we get to see a lot of aspects of Grant's life.
Yeah.
And there are places in the book where you are tough on him. The way that he hired people he should not have hired and gave them authority he should not have given them. There are places where you stand back a little bit. I was struck by, after Cold Harbor, he and Lee tried to make a deal I think it was to collect the wounded from the battlefield.
Yeah.
And in that place, you don't say who was right and who was wrong. You sort of say, this is the debate, make of it what you will.
Yeah.
And then there are places where you are much more willing to come right out and say what you think about him. Like when you say that, I think it's that next to Lincoln, Grant did more for the freed slaves than any American.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Like, how do you know, just from page to page, like, is it just your strongest opinions make it in? Is it that you want to, is it that, or is it that where the evidence, you have a strong opinion, but there's an equally strong sort of counter argument to be made? Like, how do you know?
Yeah, I mean, you're kind of making judgments throughout the book. I've always
There's
had
no
a very,
rule. There's
I've always
no
had a
sort
very
of-
strong feeling. I think that it's important that a biographer at least start out with the presumption that he's going to sort of like or admire the person. I think that if the biographer starts out by disliking the person, it can become very ugly and end up in what Joyce Carol Oates called pathography, So I think you should at least assume from the beginning, that it's going to be an admiring book. If then, as you get into the research, you find out otherwise, fine. But I have always felt, since I've written about very major figures, that a great person can carry the weight of his or her defects. I don't feel that my job as a biographer is to pretty up this person, and particularly since, as it turns out, all the people that I've written about, I ended up to a greater or lesser degree admiring. I go out of my way to present every unpleasant fact about this person, that is known. Because, my greatest fear is of a reader or reviewer saying, well, of course Chernow admired Grant because he didn't talk about A, B, C, and D. I want to make sure A, B, C, and D, are in the book. And I think that as in real life, we don't know perfect people. And we have, varied and often contradictory impressions of people in our lives, or people in the public sphere, and yet we end up having a coherent, sense of them. So that yes, I mean there were Grant, for instance, when it came to business, and this was consistent from the time he was a boy to the last year of his life, was incurably naive. He's constantly blindsided by unscrupulous people who are scheming around him. There seems to be absolutely no learning curve.
None.
On this
None.
whatsoever. He
It's
just
baffling. Beginning from 20 to, I don't know, how long did he live? 60-something. The same, shocking naivete about other people.
Yeah, and even though he's been, deceived so many times, a year before he dies, Grant has entered into a partnership with a young man named Ferdinand Ward, who was lionized as the young Napoleon of Wall Street. And Grant, in his innocence, fancied that he was worth several $1 million, only to wake up one morning and discover that the whole thing was a gigantic Ponzi scheme, and that instead of being a multimillionaire, that he was worth exactly $80. And not only
This
was
is a former
Grant,
president of the United States and war hero.
Yeah, he was the victim of the Bernie Madoff of his day. And not only had Ulysses and Julia Grant invested their life savings in Ward's operation, but all three of Grant's sons. And Grant was completely blind. In fact, Julia, interestingly enough, Julia was occasionally suspicious of Ward, which of course anyone should be. I mean, Ward was promising people 15 or 20% returns per month. Per year would have been suspicious, but Ulysses per month? And when Julia expressed, some suspicions about Ward, Ulysses said to Julia, I wish our sons, were as smart as Ward. And he said, he was so naive and so gullible that at first, when he found out that the whole thing was just a big Ponzi scheme, he said he couldn't believe it. He said it took a day or two for it really to sink in that this had happened. Now, if he'd never been cheated before, it would have been one thing, but he'd been cheated throughout his entire life. One of Grant's cousins, Eliza Shaw, said, Grant assumed that everyone else was as simple and honest as he was. And I guess that, we can see things in other people that we don't have in our own nature. And Grant, and I think the other thing was Grant had experienced so much failure in life. He said late in life, I always liked to try to trust a man long after other people had given up on him. But also in the last year of his life, he was asked what had given him the most pain in life, and he said to be deceived by friends. But it wasn't just friends.
Right. So we have this sort of common experience of being involved with Hamilton while having a book of American history, sort of on...
That's a bastard. No.
Right. Are you next going into the show? I didn't know.
I keep telling Lynn I'm ready. I'm ready to go on.
But you had this extraordinary experience, not just of seeing your biography of Alexander Hamilton become this phenomenon. This like I've said, it's like being in a science fiction movie, watching what's happened with the show. But while you are working on this book, I think you're spending a lot of time around the theater, right? So that there's this and you had been, I don't know if this was part of the introduction, but Ron was around a lot of the development of Hamilton. Lynn wanted Ron around to give notes, to give feedback.
Yeah.
Lynn always said that he wanted historians to take the show seriously. And so it was important to him to have Ron around. So I wonder, from a storytelling perspective, from a craft perspective, does that experience of being inside theatrical production shape the way you think about this story?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it was a marvelous experience because I met Lynn in the fall of 2008. I think there was only one person...
I'm sorry, you probably didn't see this. Did anyone see Lynn's tweet today? Because it's November 1st. He reposted a tweet from November 1st of 2008 that says something to the effect of, "Can't wait to meet Ron Chernow."
I really?
And then as he retweeted it, he put as his tweet, "Just you wait, kid," about himself. Sorry.
Yeah, and I think that maybe the only other person on earth who heard about Lynn's desire to do Hamilton before me is the gentleman sitting to my right, and because Jeremy was in charge of public events at the Public Theater, and Jeremy was really the one who was instrumental in having Hamilton originate at the public, in spite of the initial skepticism of Oscar Eustis, the head of
our
it.
dear friend Oscar Eustis.
But
no, it was early. It was earlier than that. It was in the summer of 2008. The first time I met Lynn, we went out for drink. The publicist for In the Heights, his first show, fixed us up, and we went out and we drank a whole bunch. And I asked him what was next. And he said that he was reading this biography by Ron Chernow. He was still reading it at that point, of Alexander Hamilton, and he wanted to make a hip-hop mixtape out of Hamilton's life, which I thought was hilarious. But now here we are.
Here we are, yeah. As Lynn likes to say, they're not laughing now. But, it was fascinating. So it was really 7 years of working with him. And what I really, admired about Lynn, and I hope that a little bit of this rubbed off, was that Lynn, in kind of taking an 800-page book and boiling it down to a show of a little under 3 hours, everything had to be condensed. Yep. And so it was fascinating to watch Lynn because he had to kind of put his finger on kind of, the dominant traits of the character, kind of what is the essence of this relationship. In fact, I think I'd probably tell you the story. He said to me one day, he was trying to figure out what was the essence of the relationship between Hamilton and Washington. And he said to me, would Washington have seen Hamilton as a younger version of himself? And I said, absolutely, because when Washington was in his early 20s, he was in charge of all the armed forces in Virginia, and he led his men into a massacre, and he regretted it for the rest of his life. And then, the next time I saw a version of the show, Washington comes out and he's singing to Hamilton, "Let me tell you what I wish I'd known when I was young and dreamed of glory. You've no control." Right. So it was interesting for me, Jeremy, because I'd always been a writer, and I found, vis-a-vis Lynn, I was really in the position of an editor. But I felt like I was an editor working with a writer of genius, where you kind of say one or two things, and then when you see the rewrite,
Yeah.
It's really quite extraordinary. You didn't have to, give him very much, criticism or feedback to get this extraordinary rewrite. And I was always just, it was funny. I don't know if I ever told you this story. Probably did, because Jeremy did this great book, Hamilton, the Revolution, with Lynn, which is really the definitive account of the creation of the show. But when Lynn came over and to my place in Brooklyn, he sat on my living room couch, started snapping his fingers, and he sang the opening number. I know Lynn is adamant that he sang the second song. I'm adamant that it was the first song. And the reason I know that I'm right, sorry, Lynn, is that when he finished singing it, he said, "What do you think?" And I said, "That's the most extraordinary thing I've ever heard. You've taken the first 40 pages of my book, and he's like shrink-wrapped it, into this 4-minute song." And kind of, but what I was thinking, and I didn't say this to Lynn, was, "Pal, either I write very long or you write very tight."
Right.
It was a little bit embarrassing, that he had kind of boiled down 40 pages accurately into this 4-minute song. And so I did, as I was, writing it. I mean, the length of the book would seem to contradict completely what I'm saying. But sometimes I would kind of make this mental, reference to Lynn and what kind of Lynn would pluck out as the essence of a particular moment.
Yeah, Lynn and Tommy Kail, his director, who also sort of share a brain. I encourage you to do this if you're a fan of Hamilton, or if you're a writer, you just like the craft of stories. Listen to Hamilton and then read Ron's biography. And what's astonishing is the distillation of the key points. Because as Lynn sort of said this flippantly, that he could have done 5 shows about Hamilton's life. And that's true, but the ruthlessness of figuring out what would make one coherent show is, to me, like the cuts are as impressive as the songs. Because there are things in that book you think for sure, like how could you make a musical and leave incident X out? But somehow you make those choices,
Yeah.
So we're almost out of time, and I want to open it up to questions. But so the theme of the festival this year is belief. Mm-hmm. You have now spent years immersing in the founding of the country, more years immersing in its greatest crisis, at least so far. I haven't read the news yet from today. But you said earlier that you like to find the figures who you think created some of the essential sort of institutions of American life. You said it more concisely than that. But what do you believe about America?
Yeah, what do I believe about America? Well, I think that what I've been thinking a lot about lately, Jeremy, particularly since Charlottesville, you write a history book and you hope that people will find it entertaining, maybe a summer afternoon, or a winter night, that they'll, escape into one of these sagas and get pleasure from it. But I increasingly feel a sense of mission about history, because really for the first time in my life, I'm afraid that we will forget who we are as a people. And it makes me realize, I've written about people with Hamilton and Washington, wrote beautiful constitutions, created all these marvelous institutions and doctrines, and then with, Lincoln and Grant, so expanded our sense of American citizenship and the composition of the country, and as Lincoln said, gave us a new birth of freedom. But what I really feel that at the end of the day, democracy is something that exists in the mind of every one of us. And the mind is really shaped by memory, and that, American politics, it boils down to the stories that we tell each other. And I think that we're still, fighting the Civil War of 150 years ago, because there are these competing narratives. And I think that there was a lot of unfinished, we're still dealing with the unfinished business of civil rights and of the Civil War. And in Hamilton, Lynn talks about the American experiment, and I think that it's incumbent upon each generation to kind of renew and redefine that revolution. But I think that it's particularly important now because I think that there's a kind of real crisis of forgetfulness. And I think that if we've kind of done a good deed in our lives, it's being involved with Hamilton, that at a time when I was afraid that there was this sort of creeping, historical illiteracy and amnesia that we've stimulated, millions of people to read about American history, and particularly interested so many American children and teenagers. I don't know that exactly answers your question, but that's kind of what's been on my mind lately on this subject.
Oh, memory. I mean, I think that's crucial.
Yeah.
Memory.
Yeah.
The way we do it, the way we keep them, and the way that we lose them, and the way that we distort them.
Yeah, and
especially when generals in the White House start offering their historical opinions.
Well,
but
there's a famous Orwell quote. Let me see if I can get it right. Who controls the present controls the past, and who controls the past controls the future. And I really feel that at the moment, and it's one reason why it's so important, our political leadership, because then it's a question of our leaders help us to remember certain things and forget others.
Right. So we'd love to hear from you. There are a couple of microphones circulating in the audience. The individuals holding the microphones are asking that you raise your hands if you have a question. This is being recorded, so please stand up and only speak when you've got the mic in front of you, otherwise it will be lost for all time. Take it away.
We'll start right here.
Thank you for your insight. What did you learn about what Abraham Lincoln saw in the man who you described as a loser up until the Civil War that led Lincoln to give Grant as much power as he did?
Yeah, it's a wonderful question, and I really loved writing about the relationship between Grant and Lincoln, because what happens, I feel one of the problems with so much Civil War historiography is that there's kind of a relentless focus on what was happening in the East, with Lee, Army of Northern Virginia, Army of Potomac. And if you look at kind of that part of the war, Lincoln is dealing not only with one, failed general after another, in Virginia, but one whining, procrastinating general after another. And they're not only losing, but then they're turning around and blaming him and constantly clamoring for more troops. But you get a very different sense of the Civil War, and from the Northern standpoint, a much less bleak view of the Civil War. Because out West, Grant is winning one battle after another. It seems to be a very lopsided war, in the West in terms of, Union victories in Fort Donelson and Vicksburg and, Chattanooga, et cetera. And so after the fall of Vicksburg, which was right at the same time as the Battle of Gettysburg, Lincoln made the statement about Grant, that man has been of more comfort to me than any other general in this war. He said, from now on, Grant is my man and I am Grant's. He said, wherever Grant is, things move. On another occasion, he said, that can't spare that man, he fights. And I think I devote a lot of the book to a discussion of Grant's struggle with alcoholism. And Lincoln and the War Secretary, Edwin Stanton, are besieged with both signed and anonymous letters talking about Grant's drinking. And I think that had it not been for all the rumors of Grant's drinking, I think that probably Grant would have been brought east as general-in-chief earlier. And when he finally does come east in March 1864, I think that he and Lincoln form a deep bond. One, they're both kind of Westerners. They both have kind of a wry sense of humor. But Lincoln actually, by that point, was a better strategist than most of his generals in the East. Lincoln realized that the way to win the war was by coordinating all the various Union armies in the various theaters of war so that they become a single fighting unit. Grant had become to exactly the same opinion. And one thing that I try to emphasize in the book, which I felt had been insufficiently emphasized before, was that I feel that the bond between Lincoln and Grant was not simply the kind of military bond that they both had a similar sense of strategy at that point, but a political bond. That Grant, who by his own admission did not start out the war as kind of, a raving abolitionist, Grant profoundly internalizes Lincoln's war agenda. First, preservation of the Union, and then emancipation of the slaves, and Grant becomes the foremost champion of arming the former slaves. 179,000 blacks ultimately serve in the Union Army. Grant tells Lincoln that arming the blacks and recruiting them as troops will be the heaviest blow yet dealt the Confederacy. And that was exactly what Lincoln wanted to hear. And Lincoln, replied, if 50,000, blacks in uniform appear on the banks of the Mississippi, the Confederacy will surrender at once. So,
good question. Thank you. Next.
So my question is, what made you realize that you wanted to, study history and, be a part of this study of, American history? I mean, for me, it feels a little weird because I feel like I'm, the only young person here. But, I really like, this moment of, being here and, hearing Ron Chernow, talk about history. I really like history. And I think if Lin-Manuel Miranda was here, I'll be freaking out a little more. But already I'm already happy that I'm here. And so I want to know what made you realize that this was the type of study that you want to do in the future.
I'm sorry.
I think the question is, if I understand it, it's why did he want to become a historian in the first place, right? Good question.
Well, my story is that kind of my dirty little secret is that I never studied history in college. I did 2 degrees in English literature, and the reason that I never took history courses was because at that point I wanted to be a novelist. So I was always taking a course in the 18th or 19th century novels that had these gigantic reading lists. And the history courses also had gigantic reading lists, and I could never figure out how I could do both at once. So I managed to sneak through Yale College and Cambridge University without studying history. So everything that I've written about has actually been self-taught. But it's funny because I started writing these books when I was in my mid-30s. And when I started doing my first book, The House of Morgan, I don't know if this is the answer you expected to hear, but I suddenly had a discovery that as I started working with original historical documents, in fact, I was up in Cambridge, Mass. I was doing research for the House of Morgan at the Harvard Business School Library. I was going through the papers of a Morgan partner named Thomas W. Lamont. And the first day of research, I read Thomas W. Lamont's complete correspondence with Nancy Astor, Charles Lindbergh, Franklin Roosevelt, Benito Mussolini, and Herbert Hoover. This was my first day of doing historical research. And that night, I remember it was a warm September evening, I was walking through the streets of Cambridge after dinner, and these characters were buzzing around in my mind. And I suddenly stopped, and I said, oh my God, this is what it must feel like for a true novelist, that his her creations become so alive. And it was an important discovery about myself, that I had the same emotional and imaginative response to real people and real events that a great novelist or great playwright would have to invented figures. And so I really think, because I particularly loved, the Victorian novel, I always loved Dickens and Eliot and Thackeray and those novelists. And suddenly I found myself writing these kind of, big sagas teeming with characters and plot and subplot, and that I was writing those very novels that I had dreamed of writing, but with materials that I myself could never have invented. That's kind of only part answer. That's probably more than you wanted to know.
Good question. Thank you. Next. Whoever's got one. If you've got a microphone, fire away.
Well, since we have lots of generals around now, I was wondering what people like Meade and McClellan thought of Grant and how they carried on their careers after the war was over.
How people like Meade and McClellan carried on, after the war. The Civil War, as I got into the book, this will come as no surprise if you've read a lot about the Civil War and the generals. There was so much unbelievable backbiting and pettiness among the generals. They were all constantly carping about each other. When Grant, who of course had enormous difficulty defeating Lee in Virginia, when Grant was asked after the war who was the greatest Confederate general, he said, Joseph Johnston. And Joseph Johnston was not a particularly difficult, adversary during the war. Lee, conversely, when he was asked who was the greatest Union general, instead of saying Grant, who had, in fact, surrounded and captured his entire army, Lee replied the greatest Union general was George McClellan, who, of course, had been a disaster, as a Union general. So they all kind of, squawked about each other. Meade squawked about him, McClellan did. One nice thing that I found about Grant that I think speaks volumes about him, after he became general-in-chief in March 1864, there had been all of these Union generals, McClellan and Burnside and the others, all of whom had been cashiered for their failures. And Grant proposed to Lincoln bringing them back. And these were all people who had been very critical of Grant, among other things. So this was really very noble. And Grant felt that it was very important. Again, he had a strong political instinct. He felt that it was very important that this be seen as a bipartisan war, and that this would be something that would create political unity. And actually, it didn't come about because his magnanimous gesture to those generals was rebuffed by those generals, who in fact did not want to come back. But it was kind of very unusual that he wanted to do that. Particularly McClellan had, spent the entire war kind of condescending to Grant.
I see someone over here, maybe.
Hi. You talked about the difference in the way you had to do historical research in the 18th versus the 19th century earlier on. It seems like we've got a lot of materials to deal with for the 20th century, so that 150 years from now, people can look back and see what happened in the 20th. But what do you think is going to happen with the 21st century as far as historical research?
These are all wonderful, wonderful questions. I think that most historians are concerned of a dearth of materials, because of emails and the internet. I sometimes kind of think it might actually be the opposite of a superabundance of materials, because we're actually going through the day. It's funny, that I've often thought, Jeremy, that if the internet had been invented first and then the telephone, that everyone would be would be thinking, can you believe it, that we used to sit there typing all these messages to each other? Now we could just sort of pick up the phone and call.
Absolutely.
Instead the internet came in because it was the new thing. We all sort of went back to typing. So we're all sort of sitting there typing letters again. So I think that the legitimate concern of historians is, even though we're now throughout the day, leaving more traces of ourselves than ever before, that the difficulty is that the retrieval technology might not, be there. So there might be all this stuff, locked up in an early 21st century hard drive that, given, the technology that will prevail 25, 50, 100 years later, they may not be able to, sort of get into it and retrieve it. But, we leave, I'm in New York. You can't go into an office building in New York without the guard at the desk downstairs taking your picture, So we have, tens of thousands of pictures of ourselves everywhere. So I kind of vacillate between, the dearth theory and the superabundance theory. The other thing that I think is very, very important, and it really has changed the lives of all researchers, is that things used to be kind of permanently lost, different written records. Let me just give you an example of what I'm talking about. When I started, my first book was published in 1990. And in order to find newspaper and magazine articles about your subject, there was something called the Reader's Guide to Periodical Literature.
God, yes.
Remember that? Is that still produced? So you would kind of look your subject up, and there were certain newspapers and there were certain magazines that were covered by that Reader's Guide to Periodical Literature. But if it wasn't, it could be completely lost. So there were like thousands of newspapers and magazines that just completely, disappeared. Whereas now with the internet, there's this automatic retrieval of such a vast, universe of information that problem of things disappearing, which was a real problem. Then there was also the problem of sort of books disappearing. You would not be aware of it. Now, and I used to spend a lot of time in the library, now in the age not only of Amazon, but of, ABE Books and, Ex Libris and all of these sites, I can have some obscure out-of-print book, about Grant that was maybe published, in 1877. I can have it on my desk the next day. I can't tell you how that has revolutionized research and made it so much easier and more pleasurable. Things that would have been kind of permanently lost to researchers are now quickly at our fingertips.
Right. And it's nice that when it comes to find all those emails years from now, we know the Russians have copies of all of them. Do we have time for one more, maybe?
We have time for one more question.
There's a question. I see someone over there.
We will have the book signing directly behind us after this question. After the last question, if you don't want your book signed, you can go ahead and leave. If you would like your book signed, please stay seated and we'll dismiss you by rows. We'll just help the process go nice and smooth.
Okay, we can do one more?
Yep.
So, thanks for a wonderful conversation.
Thank you.
Notwithstanding Lin-Manuel's wonderful shrink-wrapping ability, if there were, what are a couple of vignettes from Hamilton's life that did not make it into the play?
Well, I know one thing that both Lynn and I were heartbroken about. We wanted Benedict Arnold in it, not only because of the fascination with Benedict Arnold, but what happened after the discovery of Arnold's treachery. Arnold had been in charge of West Point, and he flees down the Hudson River, and not long afterwards, Washington and Hamilton and Lafayette arrive at Benedict Arnold's house, and they go upstairs, and Arnold's wife, Peggy, is lying upstairs, and she was sort of very, very young and beautiful, and she's in this, negligee, and she's feigning this mad scene. And believe it or not, here are these, three very powerful, intelligent men, Washington, Hamilton, and Lafayette, who are completely suckered in by this lady in her mad scene. And you could almost, in the descriptions that Hamilton wrote, you could almost sense some kind of salivating, as he was, watching this woman. And so I think we were both kind of heartbroken that scene did not find its way into it. It would have been very funny, and we would have had Benedict Arnold. I know Lynn has also said Hamilton's main adversary in New York State was Governor George Clinton. He was like a 6-term governor. He was a real boss of New York State. And Lynn said to me one day, he said, imagine, Ron, if I'd been able to work George Clinton and how many kind of Clinton puns we could have introduced into the play. Jeremy, I'll let you have the last word. Do you remember particular things that Lynn wanted?
I remember him saying that he wanted to have George Clinton in the show so he could use a Parliament Funkadelic kind of song. And I remember, there was that parade, right? Hamiltonia or whatever they were going to call, they wanted to rename New York City. It's one of those things reading the book, like, well, you've got a huge parade. Like, what a great thing to put on stage, like a giant parade is not there. Or for that matter, the slavery debate, Cabinet Battle number 3. You need things in the second act of a show to be advancing the plot, and the point of what they did with slavery is they didn't do anything. So it doesn't move the plot at all. So
no, and I have to say, I was so startled at so many of the things that Lynn included in the show. I could remember, because I would, see it every time there was a new version of the show, and I can remember sitting there, one time thinking, oh my God, he's doing the Federalist Papers. Oh my God, he's doing the Neutrality Proclamation. Oh my God, he's doing the assumption of state debts. I mean, no one else but Lynn.
I'm so happy that you just did that. I've never seen. No one's ever done that when talking about the Neutrality Proclamation before.
No one would have, dared to do these things, seemed so technical and esoteric and different things that I thought for certain Lynn would, not dare to touch with a 10-foot pole. He did, and he even, the one entire scene that was cut out in the movement from the public theater to when it went on Broadway and around the country. We actually had a scene of the Whiskey Rebellion that was quite charming. So Lynn was just absolutely fearless, and there were kind of essential points in Hamilton's career that he wanted to include. And so the two, rap battle cabinet debates, actually some of the things that I thought would be the most intractable and the most impossible to do became some of the most successful scenes in the play.
And now, like Lynn, we are out of time.
Yeah.
So please say thank you to Ron Chernow. Thank all of you. Good night.
Thank you, Gary.